One. So we're gonna just give another minute or two for people to turn up. We'll start with the program at 6:32. I'm in Queensland, so whatever that is in your time.
I see Caspian on the live stream through YouTube.
Folks, could I just remind everyone to mute yourself if you're not speaking? That would be great. Thanks so much.
So to mute yourself, there should be a little microphone icon on the bottom left of the toolbar down the bottom of your screen. Just make sure that that's got a line through it, and you'll be muted. And on that note, I might start us off for tonight. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session and on talking about poverty. And before we begin any of the kind of structured part of the program, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm calling today from Yagara and Turrbal land in Magan-djin, so-called Brisbane. And we have speakers and presenters today. May is joining us from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land down south for me. Jay's joining us from Wurundjeri land. Christian's joining us from Gadigal land. And Rick is joining us from Yagara Yugurapul land. And finally, Fiona is joining us from Awabakal land. It'd be great if, I see people have gotten started. Chuck down in the chat what lands you are joining this call from. And as always, we acknowledge elders past and present. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, that we all live on stolen land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And in particular tonight, I think it's important as we're coming together to think about how poverty exists on this land and ways that we can resist poverty on this land. We have to understand that poverty on this space is a colonial construct, and that any fight for justice, any fight against poverty must absolutely first and foremost centre Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander struggle for liberation and sovereignty. So great. I'd love to see that so many people are chucking their messages down in the chat. Thank you all. So I'll tell you a little bit about why we're gathered here today, and then I'll pass on to some of our other presenters to keep the program rolling. So hopefully you all have seen that a collection of anti-poverty grassroots organisations from across the country putting together the People Against Poverty Summit in June of this year. We recognise that, and we think that that's really important for us to be holding that space for our communities to come together in this moment. We're living in a time of some of the most intense and extreme inequality that the world has ever seen. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is an active war, that poverty is a political choice and has been constructed. We're seeing the defunding of services, the criminalisation of poverty. We're seeing the destruction of public housing and endless concessions to landlords, all amongst the midst of like a global descent into fascism and fascist ideology. That means that more of us are becoming exposed to the cruelty of the capitalist system. In times like these, like, we know that we need to come together, and that our strength is in our unity, in our solidarity, and in our capacity to organize together. Because when we work together, we have the power to make things different, but we can't change things if we are isolated and alienated from one another in our struggles. So this conference that we're pulling together is an opportunity from people who are living in poverty, people who are fighting for justice in some other way across movements of all different kinds, and those who want to stand in solidarity with us as like a poverty justice movement, to come together and learn from one another, to build connections across our movements, and to participate in practical workshops and educationals and planning sessions to learn how we can resist and plan how we can resist together, and how our movements can work in solidarity for the common goal of justice for all. In particular, right now in this moment in so-called Australia, we are also in the lead up to a federal election. We know that over the last couple of years, Labor hasn't done really anything to take meaningful steps to create justice and to do what it takes to destroy poverty. And whether Labor wins or whether they don't, we are either in for the worst possible outcome that we could probably that we could potentially imagine, or still a really shit time. So we need to build our power together and ramp up the pressure that we can put on our elected leaders to get material relief for our communities in the current context. We know that not everyone's going to be able to join our conference in person, so we wanted to create some online sessions in the lead up for everyone to get the chance to join. We also had so many ideas for excellent sessions that we could have run. We would never be able to fit all of those sessions into the 2 days we've got for the conference. So having these sessions ahead of time means that we can have as many of these excellent conversations as possible, because we wouldn't want to miss out on this just because we ran out of time. Yeah, and beyond that, we also just wanted to create a space for people to come together and have these conversations before the election. You know, that the elections bring about a time when lots of conversations are going to be happening. There's going to be lots of media attention on these political issues, and we wanted people to feel confident in talking about poverty in a way that isn't paternalistic or feeding harmful narratives. And beyond that, we also wanted to raise funds to bring more people up to our conference, because getting people places costs money. But there's no pressure to do that if you can't afford it. But if you can, consider it strongly. And with that, I will pass over to the rest of our presenters and speakers to keep the program rolling.
Thanks so much, Caspian, for that fantastic introduction, and also for that very thoughtful acknowledgement of country and all the different lands that the speakers are coming from today. For those who don't know me, which is most of you. My name is May Azizi. I'm the Deputy National Director of Anglicare Australia, and I'm going to be facilitating today's fantastic and very exciting looking panel discussion. I'd also like to echo the acknowledgement that Caspian gave, as Caspian mentioned. I'm joining today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I do think it's important when we're talking about poverty and how we organise ourselves to acknowledge that we're on land that's stolen, and that Aboriginal people and First Nations people around the country are on the front lines of so many of the issues that we are working on and activating and learning about. So we're here today because language matters. I think a lot of people imagine that human beings are creatures of reason, and that how we hear about events and how language is structured doesn't affect the way we make decisions, but we know that that's not true. We know that language affects how blame is assigned in any story or narrative. We know that language can provide a permission structure for governments and other actors to engage in the kinds of harms that we're seeing being inflicted on people around the country constantly. And as I think many people who are here today know and have direct experience of, it can lead to really tangible harms. And I think the robo-debt example is a really potent example of that. So I'm going to start. I'm going to introduce each panelist individually and let them reflect a little bit on what that means, on language, and some of their broad thoughts on how we can have language that paves the way for some of the changes that we want to see. We'll get into some questions from all of you. We'll have some discussion among the panelists, and then we'll get into questions from each of you. If you want to ask a question, pop it in the chat. We'll be paying attention to the chat. That'll be a little bit easier than trying to navigate people trying to raise their hands and get their attention from the camera screens. If you need to direct message myself or Jay to draw attention to something or to raise an issue, just let us know. And as always, any offensive, harmful comments will be moderated, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. I'm going to start by handing over first to Kristen, having heard some of Caspian's reflections about why we're doing this, and also as the instigator and one of the main instigators of this event. How can language be used to harm and dehumanize people? What are some of the things that we need to avoid when we're using language and when we tell stories and highlight our issues?
Yeah, thank you, May. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. It's really wonderful to see so many people here. And I'm also just trying to figure out how to make sure that May is not the only person you can see. Awesome. So, folks, my name is Kristen, and I am on the disability support pension. I've been involved in advocacy around poverty since 2020. I got on the DSP just after COVID hit, actually, or just before, and then got involved in organising when I had a bit more energy after having gone through my Centrelink nightmare. So I've been thinking about language and poverty and how media portrayals and the words we use about ourselves and the words that very well-meaning people use about us perpetuate the systems and structures that keep people poor for a long time. And there's lots and lots I could talk about, but I'm going to do really good at keeping it tight tonight because we're going to have lots of time for discussion and questions. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of key things. The first is government and the way government uses language. And I'm just going to drop a link in the chat to a report that you can take a look at later. But one of the things we did in this report about mutual obligations is touch on some of the issues with the language that government uses. It's euphemistic, and it's designed to really hide the actual consequences of their policies. And probably the most stark example for me that I always think of is the term income management. Income management, it sounds like financial counseling. It sounds like something we all have to do. We all have to manage our income. it sounds like something that's quite neutral. But what in practice, what is happening is that the government has chosen a specific group of people, First Nations people, and decided to target them with a racist, paternalistic policy that is rooted in the idea that Black people can't control their own money and the government must control it for them. So we call it income control. There's only one word different, but it is actually much more truthful. It says specifically what the program does, and hopefully it causes people to pause and invites questions into what is income control. Oh, it is this income management program. Hang on, why are they calling it income control? And we do this with lots of things. You'll probably know if you've followed our work much that we're constantly putting little air quotes around the term mutual obligations. It sometimes feels a bit nitpicky, but it really is intended to highlight that these are not mutual obligations. There are lots of other terms that we use to talk about mutual obligations as well. But it's just one of those things about making sure we don't submit to the normalization of these terms. There's lots of ways, hopefully we'll get more time to talk about how our own language can shift other people's perception of us. And so when we're thinking about how we speak, speaking up and speaking in power, speaking in anger is going to not only hopefully help us feel slightly better about ourselves and have a bit of a cathartic effect, but also to position ourselves differently to what people who aren't affected by poverty might perceive. And because of the way that so-called welfare advocates talk about poverty in this very othering way, it tends to present us as very sad and pathetic and helpless people who can't do anything for ourselves. And so by us speaking critically, speaking assertively, speaking with confidence and pointing to who is at fault for the abysmal state of our welfare system, it's one of the many ways we can shift people's perceptions. So I think I am at time now, May. I've got more notes here, but I will come back to those when we get into the panel discussion.
Thanks, Kristen. We will have plenty of time, I think, for all of you, each of you, I should say, to kind of speak amongst yourselves, because there's going to be so much that we're going to be able to engage with. And I should say I have failed in one of my tasks as a facilitator, which was to introduce Kristen before she spoke. So I'm just going to have to do it after, which is Kristen is the co-founder of the Anti-Poverty Centre and a spokesperson for the Anti-Poverty Centre, and a person who I've had the privilege of learning from and working with about these issues for several years now. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's a great start to the discussion. Rick, I'm going to turn to you. Rick Morton is an author and journalist. Many of you, I imagine, will have read his work and read his Substack. And I've just finished reading over summer your excellent book, Mean Streak, about the robo-debt debacle. Can you tell us a bit about how the media works, how media tropes work, and how that can promote and create an environment where harmful language is I guess, used, rewarded, exacerbated?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think the media works hand in glove with government in this sense, because, I mean, journalists have never been great at picking up on the technical human detail and the stuff they cover. Even when we had all the money in the world and all the time and all the reporters, a lot of it was a technical focus on a policy round and not so much the human impact of what they were, what policy or government decision they were writing about. And to kind of give you an example of how that kind of flows through, the government, when they created robo-debt, there was not a single program mentioned anywhere in the budget. Journos, all they had in that 2015 budget lockup was strengthening the integrity of welfare payments. At one point, it was over $2 billion with 4 or 5 different line items. Now, anyone who knows what they're looking at can see compliance. They know that there's fuck all to wring out of JobSeeker, DSP in terms of fraud, and even in non-compliance, the numbers are just not there. But it's in the budget. There's nothing to force a journalist to look at what the human impact of that is. And all of that language is designed to take away the human impact. And it's just parroted verbatim through the media, even, through the well-meaning people, myself included, going back many years. I've been on a journey. I'm learning. And it's really hard to do self-reflection sometimes. And I tried to do it in the book as well, because the media allowed robo-debt to begin. We gave cash aid to the government to start it. We created the culture of the tough new welfare cop on the beat. All Morrison had to do, and he knows this, and we certainly knew it, was he had to go on 2GB, the friendliest radio station he needed, to say tough new welfare cop. The SMH picked it up. The Daily Telegraph, they reported it verbatim. Even AAP, the extremely apolitical wire service, Australian Associated Press, whose sole job is really he said, she said, short bursts of wire copy, say, well, he's the he's the social services minister, he's on radio, he said this, and away it goes. And then you create this ecosystem that then gets completely out of control. But even more broadly, in the kind of the cultural sense, certainly when I was at the Australian newspaper, I was always having these arguments, and I see it still play out on social media today, where I don't know what the view of everyone in the room is, but I don't have a problem with the word welfare. But I notice that a lot of people have a problem with age pension being called welfare. And the editors at the Australian in particular used to get their back up when I included it in welfare reporting, because they were like, it's an entitlement. And I said, yeah, so is New Start allowance. So is the DSP. So, these kind of, there is, I hate to say it, but there's the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And it's a trope that filters through every potential kind of element of the system. And again, it's the same as Crystal was talking about with the employment services, mutual obligation stuff. I was trying to look up, I still don't fully understand exactly how the fucking TCF works and all the penalty zones and all the rest of it. But I was trying to find something in terms of, who moved where and when, at certain, what do they call it? Obligation failures. They committed a work refusal failure, which isn't even grammatical. But in the Social Security Guide, they call them the compellable caseload, which, that's exactly what they are. They're compellable in the sense that the government's telling them what to do. But if you read that through the lens of being a human being, what you're reading is kind of forced activity to jump through a hoop for subsistence, to kind of get your bread. And so, increasingly journalists, and this is not an excuse, but we have less and less time. We have less and less space to be on the phone, talking to people who actually know what they're talking about, to listen to those people. I'm very lucky because I do have all the time in the world now. I write one feature article a week, and even then I get very tired. It's not a real job, as my friend's dad says. But it's, it at least allows me time to dig a little bit beneath the surface. And it's very hard to turn back the clock on that. And I think, again, I'll end it here, but what robo-debt taught us was that if you don't have all of the media, or at least a large section of the media, writing stories about an issue, it will get swept aside, it will get buried, and they check the media monitoring reports every single day to see how this stuff is flying. They check individual tweets. So, yeah, sorry, that was a bit rambly. I came back from the gym and I feel terrible. So that's my excuse.
And not at all. And judging from the chat, I think people absolutely really love what you've said. And I think a lot of support for the use of the word welfare. And I think we'll get into that in the discussion, welfare as opposed to things like income support and social
support. Like being a social justice warrior. It's like that was a bad thing.
And just to flag, I will be asking you and the other panelists about how some of the language that gets used has directly contributed to the robo-debt debacle. I'm going to hand over now to Fiona Moore, who's also from the Anti-Poverty Centre and Nobody Deserves Poverty campaigns. Fiona, what are some of your reflections on how language is used to exclude, dehumanise and give cover for governments to harm people?
So in my former life, I was a speech pathologist and got to do some time spend some time actually studying language and linguistics, and did some projects on language in Australian, language and gender. That's years ago now, but it's just like I want to come back to that now. So it's good that this is all back in my radar again. It's very exciting. So I was just looking at when you were saying about welfare being a bad word just then, Rick, I was like, oh, I wrote something about that like long ago on my blog, and it was actually about how welfare dependency can be a good thing. We want to be able to depend on it, and we can frame it in that way of saying that being dependent on welfare is all right, because we should be able to depend on it. It should be there when we need it. It should be that silly old safety net thing that Kristen hates so much, because it just doesn't catch anyone. It's not there. You have to beg your friends to support you while you're waiting. So yeah, there's gaps. There's so many gaps, and we can't be dependent on it. If only we could be welfare dependent, that would be excellent. That would be an excellent thing to do. So I'm coming more of this, and obviously I've got that language background, but also from just being online for, my whole adult life. So for me, social media is my real life. So a lot of people here don't know me as Fiona. They know me as Phonekins or Phona or something along those lines from my online name, which is fine. And it's really weird seeing my own name in letters like that on a screen. So yeah, and I've connected with a lot of people here because social media and stuff is a way that we're actually able to use all that technology and things, use those phones that we have to have for meeting mutual obligations, for all those things, to actually have a social life for no real extra cost over what we already have to do with our little bit of mega money and stuff. So I'm on DSP, so I'm doing all right relatively, but you know how it is. It's all very budgeted and that sort of thing, and they're all still below the poverty line, whether it's DSP, age pension, welfare, or the kids on youth allowance on the least over there. So we're all just using what we can to make those connections. So so being able to use that to find that common ground with each other, solve problems together and that sort of thing. Sharing our experience, seeing one of those articles that anyone's put out from you with your much more sympathetic ear, and Kate and them in the Guardian, through to looking at something that Ben Forden's written or said in the 2GB, and actually be able to just come back together and go, okay, this is how we actually see it here on the ground. Like in real life, this is what it's like. This is what that $1.55 job seeker increase next month will be putting in our pocket, which is obviously nothing. But this is what it is. What's realistic and what's real. It gives us a chance to get together with people who've got the same similar things going on, and when we can do that, we can share what the real issues are. So things that I've come across is, I guess one of the things is like people don't realize things. So I didn't realize that like people don't realize that people have to pay for money when they go to a food bank in most states of Australia. Different rules in different states. But then I didn't realize that the actual charities on the ground had to buy from food bank itself. And speaking to my local charity leader, she's like, yeah, we spend 50 grand a year on food that comes through our food pantry, and this is a small little food pantry community thing, and that gets spun, some of it gets unsold, some of it gets given out, that sort of stuff. It's just this big business that people don't really know about until they're actually involved in it. And just being able to then control our own narratives on these things. So either through a blog like I've got, or through being able to use our own words on social media, to being able to retweet something that's clearly wrong, or community note it these days. And like saying that's wrong. Like, we don't want to hate on Labor, but we want to hold them to account for what is actually true. Yeah, so they haven't raised any pensions. So we say that, we go, that's wrong, and we don't get much response, but other people see it, so that's the main thing. So anyway, it's time to move on, I think, May.
I'm keen, before we open up to some audience questions, there's a few threads that you've all sort of laid that I'd like to kind of pick up on. I'm interested in some of, we're going to talk about pernicious and harmful language, but Kristen, I think one of the things that's interesting that you talk about is the benign and technical language, or language that presents itself as benign and technical, and income management is one example that you gave. Employment services, I know inclusion committee is one is one that you guys have picked up on. Can you, and also Fiona, I'm interested from you too, what are some of the ways that you flip some of that language and use it to, I guess, show up and highlight who the actors are and who's doing what?
Yeah, thank you, May. I had made a list of my words and I didn't even have any of those on my list. So I find a really good rule of thumb is add the word un to anything. Add the prefix un to any word related to welfare. So unemployment services is a more accurate description of so-called employment services. Also adding the word so-called in the front of any of it. It is also absurd, and we all hate to invoke Orwell, you know, it's overdone, but it is all double speak. Truly. And so I won't go through all of my words tonight, but oh man, I'm trying to remember the other ones you mentioned because I really wanted to respond to them. And I've lost the list. But yeah, I think the reason it is useful to government to use that sort of language is back to what Rick was touching on earlier, is that it's a misdirection. And so I guess the thing I would encourage everyone to do, whether you're having conversations online or whether you're talking to people in your real life, or whether you're reading media or listening to media, think about the words that you hear and have a think, just pause and go, yes, participant is a good one from Jay in the chat. Think, what are they actually talking about? And it won't take you long to figure out that most of the time what they're talking about is not what the words they've used say. And so a lot of the terminology that we use is just stuff that we use because I've had to think, what does it really mean? And that's why most people don't know what the hell I mean when I'm saying income control, and I have to explain it or whatever, which I'm happy to do and I will do ad nauseum, because we cannot just continue using that language because it's easy.
And Fiona, you talked about using language to hold governments to account. One of the things, as someone who works in a fairly mainstream organisation, one of the things I see and that I find to be a real bugbear is the passive description of events. So such and such a thing has happened to people, right? So people have been moved off of this, or people have moved from one payment to another or whatever. People aren't being taken off of one payment and moved to another. Things are kind of done. Things just sort of happen to people. They aren't being done to people. What are some of the ways that we can use language to create that accountability that you were talking about before?
Well, again, are they really being seen as people when you're saying it like that? When you're just shuffling the numbers around and that sort of thing? Yes, you're saying people, or you might be saying participants or welfare recipients or whatever words you're going to use. You're not going to do it. Again, as far as words, I don't know. I'm just, yeah, I guess. I don't know, my other language thing is indexation. We're all just indexations, not an increase. We'll just say that every day, and we'll say it again on Thursday when I'm going to be getting $4.30 extra a fortnight on my DSP, including my rent assistance. So I'm going to be sweet. What was I saying? I don't know. I'm sorry. Move on. Come on.
I think telling us how little a day you're getting.
Yeah, and that's sort of
anyone who's had a rent increase knows that
making it something real and tangible, and yeah, someone might go, oh, that's however many dozen coffees you have or whatever. Again, but that's still making it tangible, even though to us that's a completely obscene, just like weird way of saying it. But for us, we're like, all right, then this is what this is. This is how much this actually is. But going, oh, if they say, oh, yeah, rent assistance gone up again, and you're like, yeah, 0.4%. Yes, inflation's down, but rent's still going up 5%, 10%, however many percent. It's not the same thing.
Rick, I'm keen to hear from you, but again, I would be interested in the reflections of all of the panelists. How was language used during the robo-debt saga to help pave the way for something that we all knew was completely immoral and also turned out to be illegal. And did you see any examples of language being used to challenge that in a way that was effective? Well, what do you think we could have done differently?
I think I made the point in the book that the Not My Debt grassroots collective was the kind of perfect 3-word slogan that Tony Abbott would have chewed through an electric fence to come up with for himself if it suited his purposes. It was the single most effective thing against robo-debt because it said in plain language what was happening, which was that people were being hit with something that they did not owe. Whereas the entire apparatus of robo-debt, I'm going to try not to ramble, but the entire apparatus of robo-debt was so anodyne. It was so polite and civil, and people were given an opportunity to respond. An opportunity to respond. We wanted to engage the customer. Catherine Campbell's repeated that like an incantation, even on the stand. It is not an opportunity to respond when you are not being told what is actually happening to the data. People were sent letters, as you know, which just said, is this your tax office income? Is this what you reported to us? Yay or nay? That is the opposite of an opportunity to respond. That is a hoodwink. That is a trick. It's a deceit. And it went from there. You know, at every step of the way, this thing was described as a compliance program. Compliance is like the most fucking disgusting word as far as I'm concerned, because it never actually denotes what it is that they're doing. And, you know, the compliance is not, it's meant to sound moral. It's meant to sound like people are bad people, when really what they're talking about in their own briefing notes to the minister at the time was that our payment system is so fucking labyrinthine, and the add-ons and the bolt-ons in this system and the checking that we are forced to do because we decided to legislate all these conditions, it is the conditionality that creates the non-compliance to the extent that there is non-compliance. So really what the compliance is their own non-compliance. Like, their system doesn't work. Robo-debt didn't work. And like, but they kind of, I mean, the thing I will never get over to this day is how the public servants in particular, not just one or two, but many public servants were able to repeat these lines, including the one that makes me laugh because it's so absurd and bleak. And it's in the first chapter, but, you know, Data 61 are doing a review of all of the numbers, all of the program, the early online compliance intervention, which is another name they had for robo-debt alongside 10 other names, kept changing. You can't FOI stuff if you don't know the name. And, you know, they said these numbers don't add up. If you're using tax office data averaged in this way, you're going to create false debts. And this guy who's been told what to say by all of the senior managers, right up to Catherine Campbell, just emails, you know, mathematical accuracy is not core to the program. How could you say that with a straight face? And I think there's something very dehumanizing, obviously, about what they're doing to welfare recipients, but also at themselves. Like, I don't think you can live with yourself and work in these departments doing these things if you are a full human. I think there is a part of themselves that has to be extricated to do something like that, to say something like that. And I say that trying not to be a sledge. Sorry, Kristen. But also as someone who has been there and kind of imbibed that nonsense as a journalist in a past life, writing things that I should have thought more about. Kristen, if you put your hand up, you should say something.
Yes, don't apologize, Rick. You just prompted me into action, because something that we have been saying for many years, and I think people do find it confronting, and it touches back on, I think, something that was said in the chat about politeness, which is politicians hate poor people and they want us to die. And people don't like that because they think, oh, not my politician. They mean well, they just can't do anything about it. Or, you know, News Corp will attack them, or the voters don't want it. But I'm sorry, if you see human suffering and you think polls or media criticism or your political opponents' opinions are more important than human life, then you hate people and you want them to die. And that is what is happening. So when we talk about politeness, I know a lot of people feel a little bit anxious or reticent to speak in a way that is entitled. And that's because we see powerful people speak in entitled ways and speak about entitlement. That is gross. But when you are depowered, I don't like the word disempowered, that one of the things that we should feel and that we should try to activate in ourselves is a sense of entitlement, right? Back to what Rick was saying before. It is an entitlement for us to have enough to survive. We want that for every single person on this continent and everywhere around the planet, because the wealth that we have here, despite our very meager welfare payments, is also based on colonial extraction from countries that are lower income countries. So I think like this whole idea that we need to be nice to the oppressors is wrong. We should be nice to each other, generous with each other, do our best to accommodate difference, but also not be afraid to say exactly what the reality is. And so, yeah, that's just what you activated in me.
Fiona, you've got your hand up too. Yeah,
I do, because I was thinking of something earlier about that. Yeah, and thinking we've studied, I think personally, and I know Kristen's in that as well, studying yourself as more deserving as well, and trying to model that to other people, and just saying that, yes, I'm allowed to have nice things. I'm allowed to want nice things. I'm allowed to say it like it is. I'm allowed to get upset. I'm allowed to tell this person that they're wrong. If they're wrong, they're wrong. If they've just got it wrong, you've got it wrong. I'm allowed to say that, and I'm allowed to say that to a media person. I'm allowed to say that to my local member. I'm allowed to say that to anyone here, or anyone really. It's it's like we all stop at a certain point, but you're allowed to say these things. You're allowed to stick up for yourself. A lot of us here have been bullied all our lives for some way. Now it's just the government doing it in a way that's legal, we think.
I've been getting some of these questions, and I think it might be good to move to some of them, because they're coming in kind of thick and fast, as well as just general comments at agreeing and bouncing off some of what you're saying. But one of the questions we have is about how robo-debt was supposed to be about getting money back on behalf of taxpayers. How can we best counter that argument? And I don't know if any one of you wants to start, but
tax.
maybe
Oh
Kristen.
my God.
Yeah, yes, Kristen, do you want to go first?
Please. Okay. I beg you, I understand the impulse to do this, folks. I'm begging you not to talk about things that, like employment services, we should just take money from that and give it to jobs, like people on Job Seeker, or that we need to tax rich people more so that we can pay for Job Seeker. We don't need to do that. We can increase all Centrelink payments to a livable level, and we can fund a really good voluntary employment service that's actually an employment service, not an unemployment service. And if they don't tax rich people, that sucks. They can still do those things. What else should they do? Tax rich people. But they don't need, these things are not linked together. So I think what's important is that we don't try and say it's unfair, you should shift money from here to here. We say money should go here because that's good and important thing to do. Also, these people should pay more because it is unfair that they don't. And so, yes, that's just broad.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your reflections on that, Rick. One of the quotes that I'm obsessed with was Josh Frydenberg when he got up in Parliament and talked about AUKUS. He said, everything is affordable if you decide you can afford it. Yeah. Why do you think that some things are affordable and other things need to be made sustainable? I know you've done a lot of reporting on the NDIS, for example, and there's obviously some similar kind of commentary around that.
Yeah, and it's been I have a really complicated and somewhat tricky tightrope that I try to walk on the NDIS, because, I have always been of the view that they didn't do the modelling right in the first place, and my problem with that early on was that they were setting people up to fail. But again, it's not like I think we shouldn't fund disability that needs funding. It should be funded, and I wish that every single level of government worked together to do those things. One thing I'm trying to do, even today as a journalist, is to completely cut out of my personality and writing style saying taxpayer dollars. I still very occasionally let it slip through, and I hate myself for it, because it lends into this the thing. I've noticed this more being back in regional Queensland, but the scarcity mentality that is drummed into every bit of fiber on this continent it's a language of deficiency, and that if someone else is getting something, you're going to miss out. That's what taxpayer dollars does. That's what that framing does, and it kind of stirs the pot of people going, well, why do they have this thing? Why don't I get this thing? Or these people are getting all of that stuff, and they shouldn't have it because I don't. Krista, did you? Yeah.
Oh, I think Fiona's got her hand up.
Or the people who were doing all right in the 80s when they were on whatever the thing equivalent was and all that sort of stuff. It was fine then, they were fine then, so we should be fine now.
I noticed just before I came on today, there was a quote from Gina Reinhart's son. He did an interview with The Australian, and he said about his mother, she holds all the cards. The dividends I receive annually don't even cover my lawyer's bills, let alone my yacht. So don't feel bad about speaking up about your worth.
We have a question here that I think is really fantastic and provocative. If it doesn't lead to welfare but rather than harm, should the current system be called welfare?
Yeah, I saw that one come in.
I'd be really interested. I thought it was wonderful for Rick to plant that kind of flag in the ground about the word welfare earlier, but I think that's a great and provocative question.
Firstly, let me say I 100% use the word welfare all the time. I think that's incredibly obvious. I use it for lots of reasons. And I think this is where, one of the things that I often say when talking to people about how we use language is there are no black and white, hard and fast rules. There's no perfect way to say something or formulate it that we should adopt and use by rote. When we use terms by rote, they lose their meaning. So, for example, and I'm going to the video, I promise you'll bring it back to the welfare. People always ask me, how should I say this thing instead? What can I say instead of, what's lived experience? I fucking hate the term lived experience. It's awful, and we don't have time to go into it tonight, but if you're interested, contact me somehow and I'll tell you about it. But we say lots of different things instead of the term lived experience. If we just find another crutch to replace it, that does not have the effect we're looking for, which is to say something that means something. I think when it comes to looking at the language government chooses to use and the way they choose to use it and troubling and undermining that, we are troubling and undermining something that powerful people want to use. When we take the word welfare, or the reasons that I use it anyway, one is it is simpler. Have you ever tried to write a sentence talking about income support, social security? Fucking hell. I prefer Centrelink payments to income support and social security because it is plain. People know what you mean. It's more tangible than the idea of income support. But the reason I prefer welfare above all of those terms is because it does highlight the gap between what is actually happening and what we want it to be, what we aspire for it to be. And so I get that that's not a very good answer to your question, and I'm very keen to talk to you more about it because there is a difference in my head about how I'm using that term compared to all the other government ones that I just reject.
You're on mute, May.
Happens at least once every every online event. I'd be interested, Fiona and Rick, in whether you have any thoughts to add on that, but I thought that was really beautifully put, Kristen.
I will add, sorry, I'm doing that thing now where I'm like,
please.
I ate dinner before I came on too. I completely understand that argument because, the welfare system does not come without serious harm. This is where the conditionality of it is such a crime as far as I'm concerned. Watching, my mum fight for single parent payment when we were growing up and be reduced to someone with no dignity. And that was the one thing that we had. And the government still wanted to take that. And I feel like I understand the irony of calling something a welfare system when that is what it does. But I don't think we should give up on the idea that we should expect better things and demand better things. And that is what it says on the tin. That is what we should get. And I feel like we should fight for that rather than go, well, that's not what that is. And I realise that, you know, all of this could be solved with the universal basic income or something like that, which again is something I didn't fully understand when I was younger because I had the scarcity mindset. You know, it was something I genuinely believed, having, you know, watched mum on welfare and to have to fight for stuff and have the threat of it being taken away. So yeah, I think, you know, I understand the instinct to be like, well, why should we call it welfare when it hurts? But I feel like if this is a game of language, which it feels like often, I don't want to let them have that.
Yeah, I think both you and Kristen have made quite a compelling case. Kristen has actually disappeared off my screen, which is a little concerning. Hopefully she comes back, because I have one other question to wrap up this kind of vein of thought before we get into some of the things that people can do. Kristen is back. Great. This is a cheeky question from me. This isn't one from the audience, so sorry. But I think it follows on from a number of the questions that we've been getting. There's a piece of research from the UK that I'm completely obsessed with about how social attitudes towards welfare in the UK changed. And it basically found that attacks on the welfare state under Conservative governments in the 80s and early 90s were actually incredibly unpopular, and that public attitudes on welfare didn't really change until Labor started changing, British Labor started changing the way that it started talking about welfare. And actually that was the critical factor in changing people's minds. Why do you think there is this tendency among people who purport to be advocates and allies to kind of accept oppositional framing and use that as their starting point? I'm hoping that wasn't word salad and that you understand what I'm asking.
I don't want to monopolize the chat, but I have a very strong view about this.
Yeah.
So in the aftermath of rubber debt, which is the thing that I'm obsessed with most, you know, there were all of these people in particular, you know, fans of Renee Leon, the former secretary of DHS, who was secretary for 2.5 years before rubber debt ended, who were very upset that she was found to have breached the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct for her role found by the Royal Commission, and then to delay getting the Solicitor General's opinion that ended rubber debt. And alongside many other people who were not villains, were not evil, were not monsters necessarily, but who did the wrong thing at various points across many departments, I think they and politicians like them are the ones that allow the conversation to shift. It is so easy to get away with being shit when you can point to a monster. It is so easy to point to Peter Dutton and then continue to harm people on welfare and say, well, what else are you going to do about it? I am at the point in my life, in my career, in my ability to be polite to people who constantly write back to my stories, being like, well, what do you want Labor to do? Like they've been in government, one term, or who try and downplay things because it's not their team. These are the same people that turned up to rubber debt to cheer, many of them, not all of them, but many of them turned up to cheer because their coalition ministers were in the dock. But if it was Labor, I have no doubt they would have found an excuse for it. It shits me to tears. I think it's fully dangerous. And that's why I get really kind of wound up about it. It's the technocratic language that allows the biggest harms to take root.
Am I audible now?
You are.
Great. Sorry, my internet is extremely bad, so I dropped out and then I couldn't bring it back. I think, May, just in answer to your question, I don't know if you had a separate question for me as well, right, when I ducked out, but on this one, I think one of the reasons, right, is because there has been a term that Emma Bacon from Sweltering Cities introduced this term to me, and I absolutely love it. It's called a maladaptive response. It means responding in a wrong way to a problem that is real. And if your political problem is that you're attacked for being not a responsible economic manager, And the people who are perceived as responsible economic managers achieve that through cruelty, whether it is, and in the UK example, selling off public housing, destroying unions, ending the coal mining industry, and just causing economic destruction for the, in the name of responsible economic management. Then if you're the losing side, then you think, oh, that's what works, right? So you adopt that. But all these people, I don't think that we can call the contemporary Labor Party the left of any kind, not even the centre left. So I'm just going to call them the right, but you know what I'm talking about. So if you're a centre right person who thinks you're a good person, I consider you to be far more harmful to me than people who have the mask off, because I just remember the last election, right? And in every time the Prime Minister or another Labor politician was asked a question about welfare policy, and there was a lot of pressure on them, they made no promises. They had a slogan, no one left behind. And every time they were asked, they were said, we will review the rate. We believe in the principle of mutual obligations. At no point did they make any commitments, except for one, which was to abolish income control programs, which they have not done. And there are more people stuck on it now than there were before. But basically, a lot of people, and there might be some of you here on this call, believed the no one left behind and didn't hear the refusal to answer questions about what they would tangibly do. And that, as time went on after the election, I have seen more and more people's despair increase, because that language gave them hope, while Labor has tried to play both sides of the coin and say we're responsible economic managers, but also we're your friends. And so that's where that whole idea of listening to what they're saying and refusing to repeat that language in the way that they use it is important. So one of the things we did last year, and I'm sure we'll be doing again this year when they put out the federal budget, was that there's no such thing as a responsible budget that leaves people in poverty. That's not responsible.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I'm keen to use the few minutes that we have to go to some of the questions that we have about what next and how to kind of start conversations in our communities and with families and friends. For anyone looking to share their voice and speak out against poverty and the systems that we're all subjected to, how do we get started? From talking within our communities to talking to others across the community, how can someone that's interested get involved? And I'm looking especially to Fiona and Kristen on this one.
Okay, I guess I'll start. It's my turn to start on something, I guess. Yeah, I guess you're having those conversations in real life, aren't you? Sometimes. I guess some of us go out of the house occasionally. I guess it's, when you do have the opportunity to see that something's come up on the news or whatever, it's having that conversation about what's going on, what's real, what's real. And I don't know, we're, the post-truth world and stuff, there's a lot of stuff out there that's not quite right. Is it dropping a link in your Facebook group about that, if that's something that's different to something that's been set up there, that sort of thing. Just looking for things, just sharing your experience, finding like-minded people in online, because that's just where they are. Going to the community centre and just chatting with people down there, and just, there's a lot of people who meanwhile are just need to hear what it's really like. But don't do it if you're not ready to put yourself out there, because it's a bit scary.
Cool. And just to very quickly add to that, I would say one of the things that we try to do, and we are very stretched and don't have enough capacity to do, is to support as many people as possible to get involved. And there's lots of different ways for having. One of the things that some people like to do is raise awareness in the media and on social media. And if you're interested in media, we would like to support you to do that. So I'm just popping our email address in the chat. We are trying to keep an eye on it. Please feel free to harass us if you email us and we miss it. If it is conversations in your real life, and noting that Raina said we should do this more, I hope to, Raina, and it will depend on capacity, but that is the plan. And we can maybe talk more about this then. But I would say the very first thing is to understand, are you dealing with someone who has absorbed harmful messaging but is sympathetic? Or are you dealing with someone who genuinely thinks you don't deserve support, or other poor people, you might not be one, don't deserve support? So that is not a whole answer to the question, but just that question to ask yourself for a starting point is then you think about how you're going to move through that conversation, and hopefully we get time to have a proper conversation just about that. And maybe even right after this, because we have another 20 minutes to chat once May wraps us up.
I think that's a fantastic note to end the formal panel discussion on. There were a bunch of questions that we didn't get to, but I think we got to the kind of broad themes that were being raised in the questions. There's lots of support for so many of the things that all of our panelists were saying, and so many applause and heart emojis going around at different points in the discussion. I can see that there are some threads that we didn't pick up around things like tax, also lots of discussion about public housing. These are all really important things, and really good impetus to pick up more of these conversations at the event that Kristen and Caspian were telling us about at the start of this discussion. So I am going to wrap us up, or wrap up the formal panel, and now I will hand over to